The rain had turned the streets of Seattle into sheets of silver by the time Mara Ellison stepped through the bronze doors of the Halcyon Hotel, unaware that the evening would end with one of the wealthiest men in the Pacific Northwest regretting every word he had spoken. She had been invited by Julian Mercer, the son of industrial magnate Conrad Mercer. And although Mara arrived in a simple navy dress she had chosen for comfort rather than attention, she carried something far more valuable than diamonds or designer labels, a secret that could change the future of the Mercer empire. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, politicians, investors, technology founders, and old money families, while a string quartet played softly beneath conversations about billion-dollar projects and international acquisitions. Julian met her near the entrance with a nervous smile, squeezed her hand, and whispered, "Whatever happens tonight, I'm glad you came." But before Mara could ask what he meant, his father appeared across the room with a glass of champagne and an expression that immediately made her understand why Julian had sounded so uneasy. Conrad Mercer was the kind of man who could silence an entire room simply by raising an eyebrow, and when his eyes traveled from Julian to Mara, his expression hardened with unmistakable contempt. "Julian," he said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear, "I thought I told you this dinner was for people involved in the future of this company, not charity projects." And the conversations around them gradually disappeared as everyone realized they were witnessing something uncomfortable. Julian's face reddened as he stepped forward, but Conrad continued, asking Mara whether she had ever been inside a hotel this expensive before, and joking that perhaps the staff could show her where the service entrance was, while a few guests nervously laughed. Mara felt humiliation rise through her chest, yet instead of lowering her eyes, she studied Conrad carefully and noticed something no one else seemed to see. His confidence was polished, but beneath it was desperation. "You don't know anything about me," Mara finally said, her voice quiet enough to force everyone to listen, and Conrad smiled as though he had already won. What Conrad did not know was that Mara had spent 15 years learning exactly how powerful people behaved when they believed nobody could challenge them. Because she had grown up in a small apartment above her grandmother's grocery store and had watched her family lose everything after a predatory corporation acquired the neighborhood businesses around them. That experience had inspired her to study engineering, build a logistics software company called Northstar Grid, and eventually transform it into one of the fastest-growing infrastructure technology firms in the country, though she had deliberately kept her personal identity away from the media after becoming the majority shareholder. Conrad knew Northstar Grid only as the mysterious company negotiating to purchase a controlling interest in his struggling transportation division. And because Mara had allowed her chief operating officer to represent her during preliminary discussions, he had never connected the company with the woman standing in front of him. Julian knew she was successful, but even he did not know the full scale of what she had built, because Mara had always believed that relationships should be based on character rather than bank statements. "Enjoy your little evening," Conrad told her with a dismissive wave, unaware that the person he had just insulted held the deciding vote in the deal that could save or destroy his empire. Mara placed her untouched glass on the nearest table and looked directly at Conrad before saying, "You should be careful about deciding who belongs in a room, because sometimes the person you exclude is the one holding the keys to the building." The ballroom fell silent, but instead of explaining herself, Mara turned toward Julian and told him she needed to leave, because she had no intention of allowing his father's arrogance to become the center of her life. Julian followed her outside beneath the hotel's covered entrance, apologizing repeatedly and insisting that Conrad had been under enormous pressure, because the company's transportation division was bleeding money and its lenders were demanding immediate restructuring. Mara listened, but she told Julian that pressure could explain cruelty without excusing it, and when he asked whether their relationship could survive his family, she answered honestly that she did not know. Before getting into her car, she looked back at him and said, "I care about you, Julian, but I will never beg someone to respect me." Of driving home, Mara went directly to the Northstar Grid headquarters, where her executive team was already waiting in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the sleeping city. Her chief operating officer, Lena Ortiz, slid a tablet across the table and said, "We have confirmation from the lenders. Mercer Transit needs our financing by Friday, or the creditors can force a sale." While another executive warned that walking away could cost Northstar hundreds of millions in preparation expenses. Mara stared at the financial projections for several seconds before closing the tablet and saying, "Then we don't finance Mercer Transit anymore." Everyone in the room froze, because the acquisition had been considered the company's most important expansion in years. But Mara explained that she would not allow Northstar's money, technology, or reputation to rescue a leadership team that treated people according to their social status. Then she asked Lena to activate the emergency acquisition plan they had designed months earlier, a plan that involved buying the company's debt rather than simply purchasing its transportation division. By sunrise, the situation had changed completely, and Conrad Mercer discovered that the financing agreement he had expected to sign was no longer on the table when his attorneys rushed into his office carrying a series of revised documents. "Who pulled the funding?" he demanded, and when his chief financial officer quietly answered, "Northstar Grid," Conrad immediately ordered them to call the company's representatives and demand an explanation. The response was simple. Northstar was withdrawing from the original agreement and preparing a competing offer directly to Mercer Transit's creditors, which meant Conrad could no longer control the terms of the sale. Meanwhile, Mara watched the financial markets from her office while journalists began reporting that a mysterious technology company was positioning itself to acquire a major transportation network at a fraction of its previous valuation. Lena walked in carrying coffee and asked whether Mara was satisfied, but Mara shook her head and replied, "This isn't revenge, Lena. Revenge is emotional. And this is a business decision based on risk." 10:00 that morning, Conrad arrived at Northstar Grid without an appointment, accompanied by 2 lawyers and his chief financial officer. But Mara instructed security to let him inside, and then deliberately kept him waiting for 15 minutes in a reception area filled with photographs of engineers, warehouse workers, programmers, and technicians who had helped build the company. When Conrad finally entered her conference room, he stopped so abruptly that one of his lawyers nearly walked into him, because the woman sitting at the head of the table was the same person he had mocked hours earlier at the gala. "Mara Ellison," he whispered, staring at the Northstar logo behind her, and Mara simply replied, "Good morning, Mr. Mercer." Conrad's face lost its color as he realized that the woman he had dismissed as an outsider was the founder and controlling shareholder of the company that now had the power to determine whether his transportation empire survived. He tried to laugh it off as a misunderstanding, but Mara interrupted him and said, "Last night you judged me by the neighborhood I came from. Today I'm asking you to judge me by the numbers." Conrad immediately changed his tone, offering Mara a board position, a larger partnership, and even a personal apology if she would restore the original agreement. But Mara refused every proposal because she had already studied the company's debt structure and discovered years of reckless decisions hidden behind impressive buildings and expensive publicity. "You don't have a liquidity problem," she told him, sliding a report across the table. "You have a leadership problem." And she pointed out that Mercer Transit had lost valuable contracts because executives had ignored younger engineers and rejected innovative ideas that came from people without prestigious backgrounds. Conrad stared at the report and asked what she wanted, and Mara answered that Northstar would acquire the transportation division, protect the employees, retain the engineers, and preserve the company's profitable routes. But Conrad would have to step away from operational control. "You wanted a room where only certain people belonged," Mara said calmly. "So I'm giving the company a future where talent matters more than family names." The negotiation became even more complicated when Conrad's lawyers revealed that Julian had resigned from Mercer Holdings that morning, refusing to accept a position his father had offered him as part of an emergency succession plan. Conrad was furious and accused Mara of turning his son against him, but Mara immediately corrected him, saying, "Julian made his own decision long before I entered this room." A few minutes later, Julian walked through the door, carrying a cardboard box containing the few personal belongings he had removed from his former office. and he told his father that he could no longer work for a company where employees were terrified of speaking honestly. Conrad stared at his son and asked whether he was really willing to throw away the Mercer name, and Julian answered, "A name is supposed to tell people who you are, Dad, not excuse how you treat them." For the first time, Conrad had no response, because the empire he had spent decades building was beginning to collapse not because someone had stolen it, but because the people closest to him had stopped protecting his behavior. Over the following week, Mara completed the acquisition while reporters speculated about the mysterious billionaire entrepreneur behind Northstar Grid. And when her identity finally became public, the story spread across the country because of how unlikely her journey appeared. She had grown up surrounded by modest means, worked nights while studying engineering, slept in a tiny apartment during the earliest years of her company, and personally wrote the first version of the software that eventually became the foundation of Northstar's billion-dollar valuation. Instead of hiding those details, Mara held a press conference and told reporters that her background was never something she needed to apologize for, because the greatest mistake society makes is assuming that wealth proves intelligence while struggle proves weakness. "I didn't become successful because someone opened a door for me," she said. "I became successful because when the doors stayed closed, I learned how to build better ones." Within hours, thousands of young entrepreneurs shared her words, and the story became bigger than the Mercer family. 3 months later, the former Mercer Transit headquarters looked completely different because Mara had transformed the company's culture rather than simply changing its ownership. She introduced transparent promotion policies, created scholarships for employees' children, reopened an engineering department that had been eliminated years earlier, and personally visited warehouses where workers told her about problems senior executives had ignored for years. Conrad had left the company without the extravagant farewell he once expected, and although he still possessed considerable wealth, his influence over the organization had disappeared. Julian joined Northstar's Community Development Division and began working on transportation projects in underserved neighborhoods, often telling colleagues that his greatest lesson had been learning that privilege becomes meaningless when it prevents you from seeing other people's humanity. Mara and Julian eventually rebuilt their relationship slowly, not because he was a Mercer, but because he proved through his actions that he was willing to stand beside her when doing so cost him something. A year after the gala, Mara returned to the same hotel for an entirely different event, this time to accept an award for innovation and community impact. And as she walked into the ballroom, she noticed several of the same wealthy guests who had watched Conrad humiliate her that night. The difference was that now they approached her with handshakes, compliments, and invitations, while Mara remembered how quickly their smiles had disappeared when they believed she had no power, and she politely thanked them without allowing their approval to define her worth. Before taking the stage, Julian leaned toward her and asked whether she ever wished she could forget that terrible night, and Mara smiled before answering, "No, because that night taught me something success never could. You learn exactly who respects you when they think you have nothing to offer." Then she stepped beneath the lights and looked across the room, realizing that she had not defeated Conrad by becoming like him. She had defeated the entire idea that a person's value could be measured by their family, clothing, address, or bank account. Years later, people would remember the Mercer acquisition as one of the boldest business turnarounds in the region. But Mara remembered it differently, because to her, it was never really about buying a company or proving a wealthy man wrong. It was about refusing to let one cruel evening determine the size of her future, and it was about understanding that dignity does not require permission from the people who once tried to make you feel small. As she stood outside the Northstar headquarters watching employees leave after another successful day, Julian joined her and asked what she thought Conrad would say if he could see the company now, and Mara simply smiled and replied, "He'd probably say I didn't belong here." Julian laughed and asked what she would say back, and Mara looked up at the glowing Northstar sign before answering, "I wouldn't say anything, I'd just keep building." Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.